Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this AC Scotland webinar on delivering net zero. My name is Matthew Farrow. I'm Director of Policy here at ACE and also of our sister organisation, the Environmental Industries Commission. Now, net zero is a simple phrase, and it's very much a phrase on everyone's lips as we approach COP26. But the concept of net zero, particularly when you apply it at individual project level, is far from simple. So what we decided we'd do with this webinar was really try and dig into some of the detail around what net zero means in practice, how it can be applied to particular individual projects at net zero level. We've got two excellent speakers today, Ross Ramsay and Sarah Peterson. I'll introduce Ross and Sarah more fully in a moment, just before they speak. But I wanted to say a couple of words just as we kick off about AC's overall work on this incredibly important field. Can we have the next slide, Chetna? It doesn't seem to be moving on for me. So AC's Net Zero campaign, which is run jointly with its sister organisation EIC, is chaired by a task force or run by a task force made up of AC and EIC members, kindly chaired by Sarah Pritchard, who's the UK MD of Eurohappold. And it has three broad themes to it. The first is lobbying for a more coherent policy framework around net zero. I think for some years now, we've had high-level targets, we've had the Climate Change Act, but there's been a disconnect between those very ambitious national targets, both at UK and at Scottish level, and how they translate into infrastructure planning policy, into technical regulations and so forth. Secondly, we are promoting the fact that is consultancies who can be a real catalyst for change in this agenda. They're the ones who are designing assets, who are working with clients, who are across the latest innovation in this field, and they play an absolutely crucial role. And thirdly, we're looking to support our members in terms of how they can be part of this change, how they can deliver this change and play a full part. Again, if you can move the slide, Chetna. Thank you. So alongside the UK campaign, we've run a number of exercises at an AC Scotland level. We have an active group of AC Scotland members who are supporting us in that. And two key documents just to flag up. One is a briefing paper we did for the Scottish Government at their request on the role that the consultancy and engineering sector could play. So that report on the left there, called Engineering the Transition, talked about the sort of three key areas where we could make a difference. So strategic planning and placemaking, actually delivering integrated projects on the ground in a net zero fashion, and the operation of assets and making sure that operational in-use carbon was minimised as much as possible. And then secondly, as part of a UK-wide project, we've produced a series of guides for SMEs around the UK focused on the role that they can play in terms of delivering net zero and how they work with clients. And we produced a specific version of that guide for our members here in Scotland. Can we have the next slide? So a particular focus for our work, and this will lead us in a moment into the two presentations we've got today, is how does net zero make sense at project level? So in any built environment project, you've got a range of stakeholders. You normally have a policy and regulatory context within which the project must be delivered. And then, of course, you also have a market context in terms of what are the client priorities, what is the client business model, particularly if it's a private sector client, and what are the procurement systems that you're working within. So we've particularly focused in our work on how to get these different facets to sort of align better, and also how consultants can work effectively with the clients. And if we go to the next slide, please, Chetna. This slide and the following slide are just an extract from the SME Guide to Net Zero, and they give in a very simplified form a way in which SME engineering consultancies might look to engage with a client on a project to try and make it as net zero as possible. So that includes, for example, understanding what are the client drivers on net zero. Is it a regulatory driver? Is it the client has made a public pledge to become a net zero organisation or to deliver a net zero project? Is it that they're facing pressure through their supply chain and their customers are requiring them to deliver a net zero asset in a particular way? Secondly, what are the trends within the client sector? It's a real challenge. The directly controlled emissions, is it emissions upstream? Is it embodied carbon emissions or operational emissions? What are the customers' expectations around that? What are investor expectations? Very important then to agree with the client, net zero will never be the only priority in a project. How does it compare to budgetary constraints or user interests and so forth? Agreeing terminology, particularly important. Again, a lot of these phrases are used very widely now. Some of them are quite elastic. Very important to agree up front what the terminology to be employed between the client and the consultant actually means in practice. And if we go to the next slide, Chetna. And again, then particularly thinking of a smaller consultancy here, issues around project options, but does the consultancy have the right skills mix to deliver? Is a partnership that needs to be done, bringing in other stakeholders, other consultancies, other companies who might have very specialist skills around some of the carbon impacts. And then again, the delivering contractual model. Increasing interest in AC's Future of Consultancy campaign talks a lot about this. Increasing interest in future models of contracts where there's perhaps more direct incentivization of outcomes and value. That obviously could include net zero related outcomes. So again, something to consider up front. So that's broadly the sort of agenda which AC's work has been focusing on. As I say, the idea today is to drill down into how that works in practice and to get a good discussion going. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end. But what we thought we'd do, just to kick off the discussion, is to get you all involved and wide awake, is to ask a couple of questions which you can reply to. So I think we're going to put the questions up on screen now. So the first question is a Scottish specific question about the Scottish heat and building strategy. Do you think it's ambitious and detailed enough to deliver net zero? And then a second question for those of you who work across the UK, the equivalent UK strategy just released last week. Again, to the extent you're familiar with that strategy, is your sense it's ambitious and detailed enough to deliver net zero across the other parts of the UK? So we don't get a vote on the panel, but all of you should be able to vote, and we'll give you a half a minute or so, I think, to do that, and then we will see what the results are. And after that, we'll move into the presentations. It was noticeable that at UK level, we had I think more net zero policy produced in a single day last week than certainly I've ever known in some years working in this field. And the heat and building strategy was one of those 4 documents. There was also an overarching net zero strategy. And then there was a document by the Treasury on the cost of net zero. So a huge amount of material for people to get involved in. So what have we got? So not really a vote of confidence, I would say. So what have we got? 23%. Thinking the Scottish strategy is fit for purpose, and pretty much, in fact, exactly the same proportion for the UK strategy. So it'd be interesting to hear what our panelists think about that. Okay, we're now going to move to the first speaker, who is Ross Ramsay. So Ross was an active member of our AC Scotland Net Zero group when he was at Mott MacDonald. He's since moved to the Scottish Futures Trust, where he's an associate director with particular responsibility for net zero, so a real expert in the field. Ross, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, so really interested to see the results of those polls and the symmetry between the Scottish and the England and Wales version of heat and buildings, or heat in buildings, depending where you are. So I'm really grateful to be able to talk to you today about the Net Zero Public Sector Building Standard. And Chetna, I am attempting to control the screen, but yes, okay, that seems to have worked. So I'm going to give you an outline of how the standard is put together and the origins of it, if you like. And I'll also give you some flavour for some of the early stage or Pathfinder projects that we put together earlier this year, to give you to give us all an idea of how the standard that we've created might actually work in practice. So before I get into the net zero public sector building standard, I'll quickly take a step back and talk about Scottish Futures Trust. I don't know how familiar you all are with what we do, but actually there's some value in us dwelling upon the corporate priorities of Scottish Futures Trust. So you can see on the left there the 3 circles, which actually mirror the 3 priorities of the Scotland Infrastructure Investment Plan. So enabling a transition to net zero and environmental sustainability, an emphasis in place, so resilient and sustainable places, and finally inclusive economic growth. So those are important for SFT as an organisation, but as we will see shortly, they're also important for this particular standard, this tool that we've created to help the public sector in Scotland. I'm part of the net zero team in Scottish Futures Trust. I've been in place, as Matthew said, for let's say 5-6 months now, so I get a flavour for an awful lot of what Scottish Futures Trust does. Probably much like your own organisations, net zero is stretching across everything that we do at the moment. So to drill down into the standard itself, so this tool or this standard has followed me around for a number of years actually. So in 2014-15, I was working at a smaller environmental and engineering consultancy, and we were tasked by Scottish Futures Trust to do an investigation into the difference in modelled and actual performance in public buildings in terms of energy consumption. That was a really interesting project, and we uncovered some interesting points about the actual process of design and construction and verification within that, and that there was a gap in performance. And actually that you may well be aware that that gap's mirrored in many other studies. So for example, some of the work that CIBSE's done in terms of energy benchmarking. After that, a number of other parties became involved. So other parts of the Scottish Government, the NHS, Zero Waste Scotland, other stakeholders in the public sector, but also a number of other consultancies contributed something to the development of this standard over time. And it stretched to some extent. So it started being merely about operational energy, but then developed to cover some other things which would lend themselves to being part of the overall picture for net zero. So all the different aspects of carbon, different aspects of environmental performance, because we don't want to sacrifice that when we seek to achieve net zero. And also something that perhaps differentiates the standard somewhat from other environmental assessment tools, and that it also looks to consider place. So to move forward with that. So following that initial encounter with the standard some 5 or 6 years ago, I was, as Matthew had said, part of the net zero team at Mott MacDonald, and we were one of a number of consultants again who contributed to some of the documentation for the standard. So in the early part of this year, we had created a main document for the standard, setting out what it sought to achieve. And then we were looking to consolidate a suite of documentation which would allow people to implement it. So we have spent the last 6 months or so finalising that. And in the last month, that has been through its steering group. And we're pleased to say that we hope to launch all that suite of documentation at COP26 next week. So my colleague Jamie Goth will be speaking at an event on the 4th Thursday of next week, hosted by Scottish Enterprise. And at that point, we'll be able to release the documentation to anyone who would like to see it. So the standard initially focused on new build, initially focused on the public sector. The idea being that the public sector could show leadership in terms of what needed to be done to buildings for net zero. It's stretched somewhat in that major refurbishment is now included in that as well. Not any scale of refurbishment, but where we are making substantial, as mirrored in the building regulations and the building standards, major renovation. those type of projects would be applicable to the standard. We have made an allowance so that the standard can be shaped by the specific circumstances of the project, so the local authority area and the particular organisational policies. So, for example, if your local authority area has made a commitment to achieve net zero by 2030, then that would be absorbed into your requirements for the application of the standard. The ethos of the standard is that we would set ambitious targets early on in the process, and that applies for energy, for embodied carbon, for other aspects of what we're doing. And as far as possible, we would be looking to verify them in use. And actually, for some of the Pathfinder projects that I'd mentioned, that proved slightly difficult to deal with in the first instance, but all of our teams were very proactive and readily adapted to it. And that you would be setting a target at a stage where you didn't actually know that much about the building in question. You hadn't done any detailed modelling. You still had quite a lot to find out about it. And those targets are largely based around what's been demonstrated by other exemplar buildings of a comparable type as far as possible. So the benefits of the standard then are that they essentially provide a trajectory to net zero insofar as we know about it at the moment. So you've all mentioned there in the response to the poll that the route or the road to net zero isn't absolutely clear at the moment in terms of what is required for our new and our existing buildings. The standard seeks to try and address some of that to make sure that what you are doing in your project is ambitious on all of these fronts as far as we can be at the moment. We, as I mentioned, would look to absorb other specific area and local authority requirements into it. It's interesting that some of the features of the standard could propel us to prioritise reuse of buildings over new build, and we'll see how that plays out as the first few standard projects are put into work. And also there's a key requirement for energy modelling, so not just standard compliant energy modelling, but an enhanced suite which allows you to nurse your project towards the targets which you set early on in the project. And again, there's a key requirement here for verification and use, and where that verification can't be met, there's the opportunity to try and fix that later on as well, insofar as it's possible. So one of the most interesting features of the standard for me is this place aspect, and actually to some extent it's the part I know least about and I'm most keen to learn about. So I'm a mechanical engineer by background and naturally focus on operational energy, but in working with my colleagues at SFT over the last few months, I began to get a better appreciation of this element of it. So this is about making sure that your public sector investment results in the right building, the right place, the right outcomes, and that we avoid wasteful investment. So there's a few elements to this, and drawing your attention early on to the three priorities of the infrastructure investment plan. So progress towards net zero, place, and inclusive growth. So this aspect of the standard is about trying to capture this very early on, if possible, in a project as well, before any major decisions have been made about place. And we also want you to follow the hierarchy that you can see there. So as far as possible, it's desirable to avoid the actual requirement for a project if we have some of the resources which can be adapted and redeployed already within our estates. There's also a requirement to make sure that at this juncture, this early stage in the project, there is an attempt or an effort to engage with the other parts of the public sector and other stakeholders as well. So what we are attempting to do here is to maximise the opportunity for collaboration, and you'll see that in some of the Pathfinder projects that I describe later on. So that's an extremely interesting part of the standard for me, at least in any case. It may be in some respects one of the harder parts to get up and running, because we expect that in some cases projects will be coming to us a little late in the day, once they've already made their decision about what their building will do and where it's going to go. But we are going to take a flexible approach to that, and we'd encourage people to come and speak to us about it. In tandem with this, we've also, or will be shortly releasing a place guide, which will give a better overview of this as well. So moving on, the part of the standard which I'm naturally most familiar with would be operational energy, but you can see that we've included other aspects, all the other aspects of carbon in this. So construction embodied carbon, operational energy, and other whole life, which would include the actual carbon associated with maintenance and replacement of equipment over the building's lifetime. So construction embodied carbon, from the Pathfinder projects that we commissioned, it features very, very significantly. And actually, when we look at the diminishing operational energy emissions factors, in some cases that construction embodied carbon is dwarfing the other aspects of carbon in the building life cycle. So there's no absolute requirement in terms of regulation for embodied carbon at the moment in the way that there is for operational energy, but we've sought to try and integrate ambitious targets early on in construction embodied carbon, and through the consistent review of a life cycle assessment through the progress of the design, you would look to tighten that up and make sure that you were on the right trajectory. For operational energy, this was something I had some involvement in at Mott MacDonald, and initially we sought to create a suite of operational energy targets for different building types. In truth, that proved to be really quite difficult, and the significant obstacle there was that there isn't a huge amount of information about some building types in terms of the leading edge of performance. So we have lots of information about typical buildings, but what we are really interested in is very ambitious energy performance. Moreover, there's not an awful lot of good, reliable information about the split between regulated and unregulated energy in some of these buildings, which is a very important feature as well. Something that we make play of within the metering strategy recommendations for the standard as well. So you'll be able to see this in the documentation next week when it's published, but what we've created is a simplified way to look at the energy performance, with the assumption that many of our buildings will actually achieve an energy performance, or can achieve an energy performance of around or below 100 kilowatt hours per meter squared. And you'll see the explanation and the rationale for that within the documentation. So moving on, you can see the final third of the standard is related to environment, indoor environment, and also other environmental aspects. So that indoor environmental performance is very important. We don't want to create buildings which are highly efficient in terms of energy consumption, but are dreadful to work in or to be educated in. And we've set quite high standards within that for a selection of buildings, but we realise that that will require some adjustment depending on the building types that we're considering. So what we've done is we've created a process that you can follow. And again, modelling features very significantly within this. So there is an interplay between the modelling for operational energy, but also for indoor environment as well. And we have seen the interplay, and in some cases the conflicts between that in some of the Pathfinder projects as well. Again, there's an emphasis on independent check and verification, so post-occupancy evaluation is a very important part of the indoor environment analysis within the standard. For the environmental aspects, the wider environmental aspects, those are to a very large extent drawn from the place part of the standard. So we've tried to integrate a good degree of flexibility and project-specific specificity to the environmental aspects. So what you do in the place part of the standard very early on in the project will help determine what your criteria for success will be in terms of those environmental aspects. And that will vary from project to project. In some cases, it may be focused on biodiversity. In others, it may be focused on transport, or other aspects. So moving on, and hopefully that gives you some idea of the structure of the standard and how it is put together. So early in 2021, and armed with a suite of draft documentation, we had sought to actually apply some of the principles of the standard to a selection of enthusiastic projects of varying size, various stages, various building types. The selection you can see there shows the difference in scale. So we go all the way up from projects like Monklands Hospital down to very small buildings like early learning centres, so essentially 2 or 3 room nursery. But they can all follow the same process. And at SFT we have a belief that learning through doing is a good way to approach it. So any problem, so we sought to apply the principles of the standard and essentially see what happened and learn from that, and that helped inform our documentation. Also, some of the projects decided to go further, so it wasn't the intention in these pathfinders that we would necessarily pull all of the participants right the way through the standard, but all of them were enthusiastic, and some of them have decided to go further with this and would like to apply the standard to the latter stages of the project and its development. So I'll talk now about some of the specific projects, some of the ones that interested me most of all. So St Sophia's Primary School is interesting for a number of reasons, and this was one of the projects which was at a latter stage. Now, this is a refurbishment. It is a refurbishment of an existing 1950s building. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that the options appraisal early on in this project indicated that there was a really strong desire to keep and enhance the existing building rather than to demolish it and start afresh. That this building was actually a really valuable part of the community and people valued it. So East Ayrshire Council took a bold step to apply very high energy and environmental performance. And to do that, initially they had applied the EnerFit standard, which is the parallel process for refurbishment buildings for passive house. This will be the first EnerFit school in the UK if it's successful, I believe. So it fulfilled many of the objectives in terms of place, in terms of meeting with the requirements of the local community, but also these very high energy and internal environmental performances. And one of the side benefits of that is that by following a refurbishment project, they've been able to tweak their potential construction embodied carbon performance. So we tailored the performance targets for St Sophia's, and they're actually looking into how far they can go with that now. They've set a nominal target and also a stretch target for the building. The Fairlawn Learning Campus is another good example. You can see there the very impressive predicted energy use. They're at concept design stage, so they're quite early on in the process. But you can also see there that the project involved quite a good degree of collaboration. So the master plan that drew together the school function, the college function, and also some other community functions for the site was done in collaboration between Fife College and Fife Council. And in both buildings, they're seeking very high energy performance and embodied carbon performance, as well as creating really good learning environments, and also a joined up approach, which would be quite different from a lot of individual school and college sites. Pennycuik High School is another refurbishment project. You can perhaps tell that refurbishments interest me. And in this case, the building in question is a listed building. So they always knew that they were going to have to retain a certain element of refurbishment. But what was interesting here was that they decided to go a little bit further, or at least are investigating going a little bit further. They had a stock 1960s type extension to the listed part of their property, They are actually considering retaining that now and refurbishing that to meet the very high environmental and energy performance, as well as the listed building, which they had always intended to keep. And then finally, I'll just mention Maybury Maybury Primary School, sorry, I believe, which is a combined nursery and healthcare facility. So again, great emphasis and collaboration in this project, thinking about how the public sector investment can be maximised. Great energy performance as well, and you can see that this project is quite far on in terms of its design. Some interesting features of this one as well, in that it will have very little or no car parking provided. So that was one of the external environmental criteria that were applied to this project. That was quite impressive in terms of our commitment. And also, like some of the other projects we've looked at, this is a passive house project. So the standard that we've created looks to work hand in hand with a number of other means to improve environmental performance in buildings. So that perhaps gives you some flavour for the standard and some of the Pathfinder projects that I was involved in. I'll maybe hand on to Sarah now, if that's okay.
Great, thanks very much, Ross. Lots for us to think about there. So our second speaker is Sarah Peterson, who's a director at Harley Haddow. And she's going to talk about some of the projects that Harley Haddow have worked on. And also worth mentioning that Harley Haddow were awarded Net Zero Advisor of the Year at the recent AC Engineering and Consultancy Awards. So no pressure, Sarah. It's looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, everyone. So what I'm going to run through is how we are starting to deliver net zero solutions to our buildings, and run through a couple of examples of what we're starting to look at existing building stock to really create a phased and planned approach to net zero. Just see if I've got control there. Chetna, can you maybe go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So firstly, we should really clarify what we mean for net zero in the context of these studies that we're carrying out. Full whole life carbon includes operational carbon and the embodied carbon impact for buildings. Operational, looking at the loads, regulated and unregulated loads that we need to run our buildings, with the embodied carbon impact making the full picture of whole life carbon. Our studies at the moment are just looking at the operational carbon and energy. So we shouldn't ignore embodied carbon. It's not currently part of legislation, as was mentioned earlier on. However, it's something we need to consider. But in the context of these reviews, it is just the operational carbon. Next slide, please, Chetna. We know that we've got a fast-moving environment to net zero, with a number of key changes over the next few years, particularly with our new building stock, where we're starting to move away from gas with the new build heat standard. We've got interim changes to building regulations, Section 6 due for revision next year as a stepping stone to the new build heat standard. We have a number of local planning climate emergencies being declared. And we also have a number of public bodies aiming to achieve net zero well in advance of the UK and Scottish Government targets. So we really do have a fast moving picture. That changes will start to move us away from gas, as I said, and we'll really start to design net zero ready and net zero buildings for our new buildings over the next few years. But we really need to consider our existing building stock, which has a much higher carbon contribution across the UK. And it's really vital that that is considered and plans are put in place now as part of the net zero journey. Next slide, please, Chetna. So the move away from gas is really down to a decarbonising electrical grid. In the UK, we are producing electricity more and more through low and zero carbon technologies, particularly wind turbines with our offshore wind. And we have a clear path for our grid electricity to be net zero. 2050 is the date they're targeting, but in Scotland and across the UK, it's potentially well in advance of that. But we also need to consider the running cost, not just the carbon impact of moving to an electrical solution as part of a decarbonising grid. It's not simply the case that we switch over to electric heating. It's going to give people much higher electricity bills. Their buildings are going to be much higher to run. So it really needs to be considered in conjunction with a number of measures and energy saving, and it's only part of the picture to move to grid electricity. Next slide, please. With the grid decarbonising, we're essentially asking to design in nearly zero or net zero ready buildings. So what we're trying to get people to do with our building stock, new and existing, is to design something that works away from fossil fuels and gas. But we need to make sure that the energy is reduced. We need to consider how this can also be feasibly achieved, particularly within existing building stock, which have traditionally been on gas, boilers, some oil, LPG, for example, even, and look at the full impact of an electrical solution. With existing buildings, that is much more complex. It can be much more complex, particularly when we're trying to integrate things like heat pump technology. We also need to consider the actual grid supply. Government is asking us to move to electrical infrastructure, which in some cases might not be quite there yet. So we all need to consider that as part of this journey and part of the appraisals that we're carrying out. Next slide, please. So we've got a couple of case studies here where we've started to look at for our clients a route to net zero with existing building stock. We have St Andrew's House, which is a Grade A listed building in the centre of Edinburgh, which is at the moment gas boilers, targeting to be net zero carbon by 2030. Next slide, please. We also have the National Galleries, again in Edinburgh, which is the National Galleries estate. So we're looking at a number of buildings within their estate to try and pass a route to net zero for them. Now, both these projects have fairly complex buildings with specific demands. Obviously, Grade A listed for St Andrew's House. National Galleries not only have historic buildings, but they also have particular requirements in how they run the buildings, with trying to keep temperatures within set points and limiting the environmental conditions. In both cases, what we have done is we have developed a digital dynamic model of the baseline of what their current energy and carbon demands are. And using IES, dynamic simulation software, we've replicated the current building energy and carbon, and we've then aligned it with the actual metered data. So this gives us a really accurate picture of what each of these buildings are doing in relation to energy, the uses of the space, the demands to each space. So we've got a very accurate baseline that we can start to measure savings against. We can then start to appraise and review a short list of feasible options. Now, these may vary from building to building, and we're using an energy hierarchy. Next slide, please. So it's trying to shortlist what options are viable. Now, as I said, not every building will have the same option, and it's really critical that we look at them in isolation and then start to look at an estate-wide approach. So using the Fabric First energy hierarchy, which I'm sure you're all aware of, what opportunities do we feasibly have to improve the building fabric levels? Where we've got historic buildings, we may be quite limited, but there's usually something that we can do. We then can look at things like energy efficiency savings, so things like heat recovery, ventilation, lighting. Is there anything we can do with the control and management of the building and set points? And once we've exhausted all of those elements, we start to look at the removal of fossil fuels and the viable solutions of the main energy solution and demand for the building. But we obviously have to create the shopping list first. It has to be this holistic approach. Next slide, please. So looking at this multi-level approach, we can do this on a building by building basis, or we can do it on an estate-wide basis as part of a master plan. And we can start to track each of the models options using the dynamic simulation software. Critical to this is making sure we've got that digital twin, if you like, the baseline existing model that's the accurate measure, so we can really get an idea of what each of these savings are, and then start to quantify which ones will give the best savings. And this can form part of the overall review of the estate or the buildings. working towards this end goal for net zero. Now, we've got potentially methods of offsetting towards the end there. So there's so much we can achieve on site, and there's offsetting. However, offsetting should only be used as a short-term goal to try and offset the remaining carbon on a project. We really need to get our buildings net zero ready and make all these interventions first. And it's really important that we start to look at each of these so we can measure capital cost outlay on top of things like energy, carbon, and running costs. Next slide, please. So this is one of the examples we did in one of the buildings for National Galleries, where we've got the model, where it's the baseline, we've compared it with the actual meter data, and we have a very close model where we're within 0.2% of the actual metered use for gas and just over 1.5% electricity. And this is all the energy demand in the building. So this is regulated and unregulated loads. We can then transpose that to carbon, so we get an idea of the current carbon impact, and look at the changing grid. So look at the carbon emission factor for electricity as it starts to change. We can then measure each of those options, so working through the fabric options 1 to 5, look at energy savings options, option 6, and then once we've exhausted those elements, move on to move away from gas. And in this case, we looked at heat pumps and potentially PV. So we've got an overall saving with a palette of measures and interventions of just over 35%. We can then start to review the impact of the grid decarbonising. Next slide, please. So once we've made all those interventions, we have a carbon impact for each building and an estate-wide. But because we've moved away from gas, because we've made energy efficiencies to make sure that heat pumps are an efficient solution, we can start to see the full impact of the grid decarbonising. So we start off there at the top with just over 1,000 tonnes of CO2. But as we move through the grid decarbonisation effect, by the time we get to 2050, we should be at zero. But as I mentioned before, it's not just a case of moving on to electrical solution and waiting for that grid effect to take account. We need to make sure that we're giving our clients buildings that they can afford to operate and run. Next slide, please. So as part of this, we've also developed some bespoke modelling reviews. We understand that capital cost investment for things like heat pumps are very high, and we need to ensure that this will work within our existing building stock. What we've done is we've taken the results from our dynamic modelling, and we've started to look at it into detail. We've started to see what the actual energy demands, look at the peak demands and heating. We did this, for example, for St Andrew's House, which currently has over a megawatt heating demand. With the fabric improvements, we took that down to 800 kilowatts. But as part of this review and bespoke modelling, we started to look at the sizing of the heat pump and the use of thermal storage to try and reduce the heat pump size down as much as possible. Next slide, please. We also had to look at the heating study, current heating study for the building. So heating within existing buildings are generally on higher temperature based on a gas boiler. So your heat output is based on a 8271 flow and return temperature. That is not necessarily compliant with move to a heat pump, which works on much lower flow and return temperatures, so 5540. So as part of our dynamic review, once we've looked at the carbon impact, once we've looked at the bespoke modelling and heat pump sizing, we also look at the heating distribution within the building. Do we have the heat emitters and pipework circuits that can actually accommodate a lower flow and return temperature? So we carried out a study for a typical floor. We looked at the existing heating output. We looked at obviously the impact of reduced heat demand through fabric improvements, and then looked at potential shortfall for reducing the flow and return temperature, to either see, do we need to have to strip out the existing heating circuit and radiators and start again, or can we reuse? Is it something that we need to look at higher temperature heat pumps, which obviously has an impact on performance and efficiency and therefore running costs? Or can we make further improvements? Or add in supplementary heating. And for St Andrew's House, we found that we had obviously reduced the fabric loss down. However, there was still a small shortfall, whether we looked at startup or not startup, but that still needs to be supplemented. And that needs to form a key part of the review when we're carrying out these net zero studies. Next slide, please. And finally, we also really need to consider the potential overheating risk. We are asking to make these fabric improvements to our building. We're trying to make them more airtight, to reduce energy, to make these net zero solutions more cost effective and technically feasible. But at the same time, we have the impact of climate change. Our climate is changing, the external temperatures are getting higher. So we need to make sure that with every solution we're putting forward, we're not creating more problems for ourselves. So what we've done here is we've reviewed the internal temperatures with the changes of fabric, with the increased airtightness levels, to see if we would actually end up having a negative impact on carbon, so increasing potentially our cooling demand across the year. We found in this case that although there was a peak increase, the fact that we're starting to look at potential ventilation strategies, one for carbon reduction and two for part of the COVID ventilation review, that was mitigated. So the actual overheating risk was mitigated. But it really has to be a full holistic review when we are considering these elements, particularly for existing buildings, because it isn't just a case that we can plug in a heat pump and get on the road to net zero. We need to consider all of these elements, and they all need to be considered very early on. And it's the point of using dynamic simulation modelling allows us to do that with quite a degree of accuracy, so that we are presenting an achievable solution to our clients. That's me. I'll pass back over to you, Matthew. I think we've got some time for questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah. Some really good projects there. So we've got a bit of time for questions, as you say. People are able to post questions in the chat, and then we'll field them from here. And I guess it'd be interesting, given most of the people watching today didn't have a great faith in the two heat and building strategies coming out. Be interesting, I guess, to hear what people would like to see in those. What we'll do, though, I think, Ross, Sarah, if you want to keep your cameras on just for the Q&A, no hiding from any difficult questions. We've had one question pre-submitted by an attendee, so we'll start with that, and I'll read it out. It's a question about heat networks, and the question is: following a very calm weather spell in September with low wind, and I guess therefore low wind power generation, coupled with, in all likelihood, no future Scottish nuclear plants, should heat networks include combined heat and power? So question about, I suppose, the role of heat networks and CHP against a backdrop of intermittent renewables. Sarah, any thoughts on, from a sort of master planning point of view, I suppose that would be, wouldn't it?
I do think district heating networks will play a critical role as we move to net zero, particularly for existing building stock, particularly existing domestic building stock, where it's not simply the case that we can just plug in a heat pump or an electrical solution, and district heat networks will make that a key consideration. And it is a key point to actually look at how our grid electricity is being produced. So I'm not sure if some of you are aware that the online tool where you can track the breakdown of electricity generation in the country. Scotland is obviously doing a lot better generally with the carbon intensity compared to the rest of the UK. So it is still a bit of a mixed bag, though. So we've got gas being shipped across the country that's being used. We've got nuclear playing key part. So we do need to keep that in consideration. And gas will no doubt still have an element of impact for years to come, but it's how we start to move away. And is there anything else that we can look at with new technologies?
Ross, any thoughts from you on heat networks and CHP?
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting for me within that is perhaps I'm taking the question in our direction, but the potential lots towards hydrogen, and whether hydrogen CHP might be part of the picture as well. I think in the longer term, though, gas-fired CHP, especially at smaller scale, probably you would think wouldn't be part of the picture, given the difficulties of capturing carbon at smaller scale, that we would be looking to move away from that. But as Sarah says, it could be part of a transition, or part of the arc towards it, if you like.
Yeah, I think some of the CCC analysis, in some scenarios, they have it for sort of covering peak loads, but gradually being phased out as we go forwards. Okay, questions come in for yourself, Ross. The schemes noted, how was embodied carbon calculated? Were any changes in materials or design considered?
Yeah, so embodied carbon was actually one of the most important and interesting parts of the Pathfinder processes for each of the participants that we engage with. So those projects that I mentioned towards the end of my presentation. The particular consultant that we had providing advice on that point could probably tell you more detail, but I know that one click was used as part of the assessment. I know that the RICS methodology for the different categories of carbon was considered as well. The materials and design changes, yes, that was something that featured, and apologies, I didn't actually weave that into my presentation, but I can tell you that there was a move away from steel towards wooden and composite frames in some of the projects that we looked at there. There were also some interesting questions around the insurances for some of the materials that were proposed as well. So the engagement with insurers wasn't entirely resolved at the conclusion of the Pathfinder involvement there, but the actual fire risk associated with some of those hadn't been fully resolved in the eyes of the insurers. So that perhaps there's some work to do there to make sure that an understanding of those materials and how they increase or don't increase fire risk, as maybe the case, is needed for some of the materials that we think are going to be important here. So yeah, I could provide more detail on that, but certainly embodied carbon was very, very rarely received as part of the Pathfinder process for the ones I was involved in.
What we can do, actually, Ross, we can put you in touch directly with the colleague who asked the question, so that if they want to follow up on any detail, they can. Just to sort of follow on from that, though, and you both made the point that, you know, embodied carbon, there's much less regulatory sort of legislative pressure, but in many cases, it's a huge part of the whole life carbon cost. And, you know, struck by your point there, Ross, about you know, there's both the effort being put in to innovate around low carbon materials, but then their sort of acceptability in the market, I suppose, you know, including things like insurance. What's the sort of big thing we need to do collectively to try and move that agenda on? Is it, you know, is it around the more sort of legal technical things, or is there just not enough innovation in terms of how we can actually produce lower carbon materials coming through, or there won't be enough supply of those materials as increasingly globally people are looking to use them in buildings? I mean, Ross, any thoughts? Then I'll come to you, Sarah.
I think we probably need to tackle on a number of those fronts, tackle the problem on a number of those fronts, Matthew. I think that one of the things that we can do, and it's not the only part of the solution, would be to actually develop better data around what's possible with embodied carbon, both in refurbishment projects, but also in new build projects as well. I think one of the things that struck us was that the project teams, or the participant teams from the Pathfinder projects, were really desperate to get their heads around this and weave it into what they were doing and the complexity of the design. But it's not something that is really well embedded. So if we think about different aspects of the standard, there's a complexity about achieving the energy performance that you want. There's a complexity about achieving the internal environmental performance that you want. And then you go and add to that complexity by including requirements for embodied carbon as well. So that's quite a complex thing that your designers need to deal with. And I think a lot of the teams that we dealt with were still had fantastic expertise, and had the best intentions, but they were still getting their heads around how they managed that complexity, if you like.
Yeah, I would agree on that path. Embodied carbon still seems to be a bit further away for design teams to be able to review. I mean, I've carried out a couple of embodied carbon assessments myself, and it is pretty complex. There is a limited palette of materials that you can review from. We also know that the London plan is requiring embodied carbon assessments to be carried out as part of major refurbishments and new builds. And I'm aware that CEC Edinburgh Planning are starting to look at that as part of their move to 2030 net zero. So it is going to come more to the forefront, but we do need probably a little bit more materials to pick from, a little bit more of selection, and probably more access to calculation tools.
Yeah, I think that came up in some of the pathfinders as well, Sarah. So.
Okay, we're running tight on time, but another question has come in, so let's make sure we squeeze this one in. So this question says, for the new NS-CPSB standard, how are the operational targets calculated? 100 kilowatt hours per meter squared seems okay for some buildings, but too easy for others, and doesn't align with other energy use intensity targets, such as the UK GBC framework standards. Ross, come to you first.
Sure, yeah, so you're right, Ingrid, I think it is, it's quite a blunt tool, if you like, and we agonised over this for quite a while. What I would say is that we're conscious of a number of things when we apply that 100 kilowatt hours. So not every building is going to end up in that category. So we would expect, for example, leisure centres, etc., to be higher than that, to be quite honest with you, in terms of their performance. And we expect that actually will be not lenient, but it will mean that there is some slack for some building types within some of the categories that we're talking about. So, for example, it's been fairly well demonstrated that primary schools and even secondary schools to some extent can achieve energy performance that's probably below that. Through standards like passive house, etc., etc. But there's a few things we're conscious of when we apply that. So there are an awful lot of building types which are not well defined in terms of what really good performance looks like. And there have been plenty of attempts to make buildings which are really high performance in some of these categories that haven't gone very well at all. So I can draw your attention to the raft of actual building consumption data in databases like Carbon Buzz, etc. So we have tried to take account of the uncertainty that we have around some building types, and particularly the unregulated loads in some of these buildings. There isn't actually an awful lot of good knowledge about the unregulated loads as things stand in 2021 for some of these building types. So, for example, health centres, we did quite a lot of detailed half-hourly analysis for existing health centres, which in some respects are the best models for, at least for the unregulated loads that we're talking about. Some of the actual consumptions that we see in these buildings are difficult to explain, but that's what you're actually dealing with some of these buildings. So that 100 that you see allows a little bit of slack there. We're conscious as well that we're not going to be dealing with the best of the best of the best every single time. We want this standard to be applied, not in every public building, but a large number of public buildings. So we want a good performance, an ambitious performance, but one which is realistic as well.
I think that regulated versus unregulated load is also a really thorny issue, isn't it? Just about out of time, but Sarah, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
No, just to really agree with what Ross saying. It's trying to make sure we've got a really accurate measure, and certainly from the studies that we've carried out, not every building is the same, and there can be wide disparities depending on the specific nature of the building. So it's trying to get as accurate as benchmark as we possibly can, and there is always going to be a slight flux depending on the buildings.
Okay, well we'll end it there. We're right on 1 o'clock, and I know a lot of people will have either be rushing off to hear what goodies Rishi Sunak is going to bestow upon us all, or going straight to another meeting. Thank you very much to our two speakers today, Sarah and Ross. We've recorded the webinar, so we'll send a link to everyone who registered for it in the next few days, along with a copy of the slides. We hope you found it interesting. Obviously, COP26 coming up is going to dominate the agenda for our sector for the next few weeks. AC will be sending out various updates and briefings on COP as it unfolds and in the aftermath. Our next Net Zero webinar is on the 25th of November, where we've got a session on master planning and the role of consultants in master planning for Net Zero, where we're looking at a case study, a Jacobs Enfield Council case study, which I think will be really interesting, and also a chance at that webinar just to reflect on the messages that have come out of COP and how that might affect us all. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you again to Ross and Sarah, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks all.